Selamat sore.
Good afternoon. The Indonesia G20 presidency has successfully produced a G20 leaders declaration. The G20 leaders declaration, which initially was doubted by many. The declaration consists of 52 paragraphs, and the most debated paragraph was on the stance on the war in Ukraine. The discussion on this matter was very contentious, and at the end of the day, the leaders of G20 agreed on the content of the declaration, namely condemnation to the war in Ukraine, since it is a violation of territorial integrity. This war has caused massive public suffering and also jeopardizing the global economy that is still vulnerable from the pandemic, which also cause risk for food and energy crisis as well as financial crisis. The G20 discussed about the impact of war to the global economy condition. Some concrete actions and tangible actions were also agreed, including the establishment of pandemic fund, and so far we have raised 1.5 billion US dollars for the pandemic fund, and the establishment and operationalization of Resilient and Sustainability Trust under the IMF in the amount of 81.6 billion US dollars to assist countries suffering from crisis. And also the energy transition mechanism, especially for Indonesia, which has received commitment from JEPT, Just Energy Transition Program, in the amount of 20 billion US dollars. The joint commitment that at least 30% of the world land and 30% of the world sea will be protected by 2030. And also continue our commitment to reduce land degradation by 50% by 2040 voluntarily. I think these concrete and tangible agreements, even though to name a few, because there are actually many other tangible agreements reached in this forum. I think that's all.
One from Indonesia and one from international media.
Please, Indonesia first. Indonesian journalists first.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Pak Jokowi. I'm Sweetie from the New York Times. I wanted to ask about the missile strike in Poland. Were you worried that those events in Poland would have derailed your agenda at the G20? Thank you.
First, I regret the incident in Poland. I call all parties to remain calm and refrain from escalating tension. I always state that war will only bring devastation. Therefore, we must stop the war. And President Biden himself has already said that the missile is unlikely coming from Russia.
One more question from national media.
Thank you, Mr. President. My name is Dipo from Kompas TV. First of all, I would like to congratulate you because this summit has been successfully concluded amidst the increasing geopolitical tension. You mentioned earlier that this declaration is called Bali Leaders Declaration. This is actually the first declaration that has been agreed since February 2022. We have received the draft, and if I recall correctly, the last communique was issued in February 2022. Do you think that Bali Leaders Declaration was really agreed by all leaders attending the G20 summit, including Russia? Did Russia also agree on this? And maybe you can also explain. I think the title is not important. We can call it communique, we can call it statement or declaration, but maybe you can explain whether this declaration is the same with joint communique. So, the most debated paragraph is only one paragraph, which is our stance on the war in Ukraine. Until late midnight yesterday, we discussed about this, and at the end, the Bali Leaders Declaration was agreed unanimously in consensus. We agreed that the war has negative impact to the global economy, more or less like that. And the global economic recovery will also not be achieved without any peace. Therefore, in my opening remarks, I called for the end of this war. To end this war. Aside from the Bali Declaration, the leaders also have agreed on tangible cooperation in the health sector. As I mentioned earlier, we have raised 1.5 billion in pandemic fund, as well as the Just Energy Partnership transition, as well as the digital transformation cooperation. And we also have the Russian representatives attended the summit at that time. So even though the debate was heated, but everyone has agreed, and the Bali Declaration has been announced. And after this, I would like to ask the ministers to continue with other explanations, but I would like to add that, again, I would like to remind everyone that G20 is an economic forum, a financial forum. a development forum. It is not a political forum. So please do not try to sway the issue to political issues.
Conference room. Thank you. Makasih ya, Mak. Maaf ya, kalau kurang.
Bentar aja. Ya. Berapa pertanyaan aja, Bu? Ibu mau berapa pertanyaan? 5 pertanyaan? 3 pertanyaan?
Jangan dorong-dorongan ya, tolong pelan-pelan, pelan-pelan.
Yes, please. Please, the one in front. One. Yeah, please give him or her the microphone. But please be seated first. What is your media outlet, ma'am? UN SDGs. Okay, one from UN SDG, one from BBC, one from CNBC. Oh, not CNBC, CNN. Please. Thank you, Minister Erlangga, Minister Sri, Minister Ratno. My name is I am from UNSDG 28494. I would like to report the potential violation of Nagoya Protocol by Japan, while the leaders of the national institutions has retired. Only questions related to G20, not the Nagoya Protocol on fair distribution and utilization of bio. This is the question directed to Ibu Ratno Marsudi. President Jokowi mentioned that the most debated point was on the war between Russia and Ukraine. The question is, is Indonesia is among the members that condemned the war in Ukraine. The president has explained that the result is a declaration or a communique, which means that all members, including Indonesia, have agreed on this declaration, because if there is any country that does not agree, then the form of the outcome document will be different. And since we need to unanimously agree on everything, the negotiation, of course, very long. There are several rounds of negotiation, and the last round of negotiation was started on the 10th of November until the 14th of November. And in that negotiation, sometimes the mandate of the negotiators ended. They cannot negotiate anything further, which means that they need to consult someone higher up in the hierarchy. Therefore, from the 10th to the 14th of November, I intensively communicated with other ministers of foreign affairs so that we can agree on a declaration. When it comes to, also we mentioned that the geopolitical paragraph was the one debated the most, but it doesn't mean that other paragraphs were not also being debated. But we are actually in an advantageous position, and we managed to engage everyone one by one. And we also need to be grateful because we have trust from all G20 members to Indonesia. So at the end, we can agree on a declaration. Earlier, the president said that in the beginning, everyone was pessimistic. Nobody was sure or was optimistic that the communique or the declaration can be agreed by all members. This is based on trust. We are deploying our long-standing and long-built diplomacy assets, and we are always trying to bridge any differences, no matter how wide or how deep the differences is. CNN, good afternoon, Ibu Ratno, Pak Erlangga, and Ibu Ani. I have several questions. First, about the leaders' declaration, paragraph 12. I would like to ask this to Ibu Ani and Pak Erlangga. Paragraph 12 was on realizing the commitment in 2019 to lift fuel subsidies. I would like to ask whether this is in line with Indonesia's commitment to transition to green energy. And one question to Ibu Minister Ratno: how is the success of Indonesia G20 presidency will affect our international diplomacy power? So that's actually, we agreed to actually lift the fuel subsidy, but the technicalities on how and when will be explained by the Minister of Finance. Paragraph 12 is on the achievement of SDG 7, Goal 7 of the SDG, access to energy, and also eliminating poverty that is stemmed from energy insecurity. But at the same time, energy is also a sector that produces carbon dioxide emissions, one of the biggest sector that produce carbon dioxide emission, including in Indonesia. If we see our NDC, the energy sector is the one that actually produce the most carbon dioxide, and also the most hard to achieve in terms of the balance to reduce the emission. But SDG 7 is about how we can close the gap between those who do not have any access to energy, or who have access to energy, and those who do not have any access to energy. And in this paragraph, we discussed about different measures that should be taken. So, for instance, low emission carbon for energy sector, and among others, we also mentioned about phasing out of fossil fuel and coal. This is actually one of the paragraph that was not easy to achieve, because in G20 we have Saudi Arabia and UAE that is rich in fossil fuel. So they ask for a more prudent phasing out and more gradual phasing out. And when we talk about transition to green energy, it is not only a matter of subsidy, but also financing to retire or to decommission coal-fired power plant, and also investment for new and renewable energy. So if we see, starting from 2009 in Pittsburgh, when the G20 was initiated, they have already mentioned about phasing out and rationalizing untargeted subsidies, and how we can increase access of energies, especially for the poor and marginalized, and also reducing emission from the energy sector. So that's actually something that we always have to balance. And for G20, as mentioned by the President, for energy transition mechanism, Indonesia received very strong support. We have designed the phasing out of coal sector. We received 500 million funding from Climate Investment Fund, and also from Just Energy Transition Partnership Program. 20 billion indicated fund from various sources that can be used and will be dedicated for energy transition. So this is all come in a package. Madam Foreign Minister, so in this energy transition program, the US government also launched PGII, Partnership for Global Infrastructure, and one of them is to transition to green energy. The total package is $600 billion US, and including in the package is initiative from Japan and JETP, and we have already received 20 billion fund commitment, which will help us to accelerate the decarbonization in Indonesia. So the question was how the world sees our achievement. I think let the world answer this we should not assess or grade ourselves, but from what I see in the beginning, many or almost everyone were pessimistic. Everyone said that, oh, no leaders' declaration will be produced. And in other international fora, in almost all international fora, leaders' declaration were not agreed. But by producing a leaders' declaration that is agreed by all members of G20, this is actually something amazing. We started from differences, but we see that there are some commonalities, there are some issues in which we can cooperate in. So in the beginning of our presidency, and after February, we communicate with all members intensively. We ask them, are we still going to cooperate? And everyone answered yes. So from that small commitment, we try to capitalize on that. We try to use that as leverage, and the result is this declaration. The presidency is about negotiation, and the most important factor here is trust. And we have the trust from all members. Two more questions?
From Katadata and TVRI. And one from China. Katadata. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have few questions. Number one is for Ms. Retno. Indonesia is doing free and active political stance, and because one of the point of declaration is condemning the war in Ukraine, you are leaning to one side. Am I wrong? And second, for Mrs. Retno as well, point number 33 on declaration. We have SDR, and it will be continued by India. How can we get to 100 million out of the 81 million right now, and where do the commitments come from? There are many parties seeing that free and active are neutral. I think free and active means that we are free to determine the position, opinion, and active in actively contributing to achieve peace globally. And we are known in our foreign policies to implement principle-based policies as contained in UN Charter. And you can see the consistencies in implementing this. When we are talking about territorial integrity,
very clear, consistently.
Terkait dengan SD.
On SDR, essentially, paragraph 33 on number one, the ability of multilateral institutions to respond, the need for countries due to pandemic. After pandemic, there are a lot of countries implementing fiscal space, monetary space, and we have energy and food crisis, and many are not sustainable. IMF, in this case, offered a mechanism, 81.6, in which voluntarily the member of IMF can lend their SDR and contributed to become the source of other countries needing that funding. And 81.6 billion is from IMF countries, especially in the special drawing route, is equivalent to can be lent to to be utilized by poor countries. I do not have the list of the full countries, but this is something that the countries who are certain that they are not going to utilize their SDR in the near future. If I may add a little or strengthen what our Ministry of Foreign Affairs has reiterated, Ministry of Finance have 7 times or the highest frequency of meetings. And this is, we have communique in February by the Ministry of, that's the only communique before the war in Ukraine, and after that, we are unable to produce communique. We only have chair summary, but this to illustrate the differences, the condition before and after the war happened, as iterated before by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and our president. And until last week, we still have a joint finance and health meeting. So we have 8 times meetings in total, and still in a ministerial meeting. And on the paragraph on the war, we did not have an agreement. Therefore, we only had an agreement on leaders level. What does it mean? It means that during the process of negotiations that take months, the members of G20 fully respect Indonesia's position, that continuously try to bridge the differences, and we are not trying to isolate other countries and continue to create momentum for cooperation. And that is one of the factors under the leadership of President Joko Widodo is very clear that we have the respect and trust. Lastly, from China, because we have limited time.
I'm from China Central Television, the Chinese media group. Thank you so much for this chance. I would like to know, because Chinese President Xi had 2 important speeches during the G20 summit, which he explained the 3 points of his global development initiative, and he also proposed the digital Silk Road this afternoon. So how do you comment on this issue, and what do you think this can benefit to the whole world? Thank you.
I think the digitalization we appreciate because that is in line with Indonesia focus on transformation of digital. And I think that's also in line with Indonesia chairmanship on ASEAN, that we target to make this detail of economic framework within a digital economic framework within an ASEAN. So I will sign an MOU with President China right now. So if you allow me to leave this room, the more faster I sign the MOU with your Minister of Commerce. Saya rasa karena sudah terbatas.
Due to the time limitation, last question from TVRI.
Silakan, mungkin langsung dari Ibu.
Jadi selain deklarasi yang kita
Aside from the declaration, if you see the document, it has some annexes, especially Annex B. Annex B is G20 actions for strong and inclusive recovery. This is a list of cooperation projects. And maybe you ask why we have that kind of annex. This is actually to fulfill the Indonesia's G20 pledge that we want to bring G20 closer to concrete cooperation. So there are 361 cooperations in that annex. And during the presidency, I am looking at the Minister of Health, that's why I call it pandemics. During the presidency, we are also strengthening cooperation, bilateral cooperation with G20 countries in 3 priority sectors, and we have 140 cooperation programs. So aside from the Bali Leaders Declaration itself, there are other achievements, including tangible results. So there are two baskets. The first basket is trilateral, 115 projects in health sector, 34 in digital, and 35 in energy transition, and 111 in other sectors. In basket one, that includes carbon capture. TVRI, okay, we'll talk to you later in the next section.
Keluar. Ya semua. Nanti orang Prancis ya. Nanti orang Prancisnya ya. Orang Prancisnya akan. Tinggalkan aja ruangan.